Vaishali, how are you?
I'm great, Tammy. Excited
Good.
to see you.
I'm so glad to have you join us. This is the very first podcast for this year for the CLMRX. So I'm super excited to have you join and kick off the new season. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to say that we have met each other a roundabout way through some colleagues of ours that we have in common. One being Arjun, and I also think Rory Widmer. She's doing some great stuff in your area. And so we got connected in that way, and we've had some great conversations. And I'm super excited to share what you're doing in the industry, particularly around innovation in the legal space. So, first of all, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your career background and how you arrived at what you're doing today? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Tammy. I'm very
Of course.
excited to be on. So while I'm a lawyer by education, I graduated somewhere in 2006, so a very long time ago. And I worked for a stockbroking company for a while in their in-house legal team. And then I went for my master's to Duke. And
Okay.
I did a general LLM over there, focusing on corporates and a couple of specializations. But then when I was thinking about what I wanted to do next from there, the thought was to go into in-house. I didn't want to do a law firm at that point, and I wanted to go on the business end. So that's where I started thinking about this, and I moved back to India at that point. And oddly, I think this is a little bit of destiny, I would say. As I was, like interviewing with different in-house teams, I also came across a company called Pramata, who's now a veteran
Mhm.
CLM
Familiar with
company.
Pramata.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
At that time, I think we were about 20 people. I just met the leadership team, and I was really intrigued by what they were doing. And I really liked the people. I was intrigued by the product at that time. And there was no reference point for legal tech then. It was
Yeah.
just very unusual. And I don't know, I
Mhm.
just had an instinct to say, okay, let me try this out. It's my second job. I'm not going to, lose anything by, taking that route. Let's see. If I don't like it, I can always move back to other things.
And
And
what kind of work did you do for Pramata at the time in those
yeah,
early days?
when I started out, I was on their contract review team doing a lot of analysis on the contracts. But then as the company grew, they set up a sales solutions team in India, and I set that team up to support POCs and the way you do solution design for CLM at that point. And I helped set that team up and helped hire people. We
That
ran
was
the
awesome.
initial processes. Also, part of that role was figuring out how you would implement, which was taking it back to the delivery team on what they needed to be trained on what was sold, and how do you look at quality and all those aspects. So I did that for a couple of years. And then again, as the next shuffle of the company growing, I actually moved into heading operations as a whole. And from there,
Okay.
the expansion grew from solutions to taking on customer success, project management, all these areas. A lot of that experience was learning a lot about how do you manage resources and how do you build your team and budgeting and all those aspects for delivery, and
Yes.
how do you look at that. And then I took a shift where I actually moved out of the country. My husband moved to Egypt, and at that time it wasn't feasible to continue that role. And the thought came out saying, why don't you join the product team, because it's the time zone would work both with the US side and then the India end. And I would say that was quite a career defining moment for me, to move from like solutions, contract review, operations to product, which is such a unique space. And I had no reference
Yes.
point, honestly. Very challenging, a lot to learn. I started out first on our customer facing side and the
Mhm.
experience there. Then I moved to building the tools that our implementation team needed to actually the
Right.
CLM.
Enablement. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I basically took over that roadmap, and then a few years down the line, I took over the product team itself. So that journey kind of went through multiple iterations, but I think throughout my experience in Pramata, I had a huge opportunity, one, to keep changing roles and mental models as I went along the journey, and the second was also I spent a lot of time in the early years working with clients. They sell in North America, so essentially a lot of general counsels and legal teams in North America at that
Yes.
time, and how, so I got a little bit of an inside view on how contracting was happening in that space. What were the challenges that were happening? Why were organizations at that time considering even CLMs? Now it's a different story. The industry shifted a lot. A lot of organizations are
Yes.
considering it. But back then, I think it was always a volume problem. It was always the largest
Yeah.
organizations who needed a CLM, sure, because of the volume, and who could also afford it at
Right.
that point, right?
There's so many questions just about your experience at Pramata because and we'll segue into what you're doing now and how it's led you there. But I think you have such a unique perspective in seeing an implementation and seeing what the challenges are for legal teams around documents and document management, looking at the contracts, and then pivoting from that full end-to-end sort of road mapping of how you implement and how you look at a solution and design a solution. Because us in the industry know there are many ways to tackle that problem when you're talking about designing to meet requirements for a customer. And so you really have to think through sort of an end-to-end global consideration for how to allow them to reach their goals. Of course, in scope and budget and time and all of those parameters that we're all always working in. And then pivoting to the product side where you're looking at it from a whole different angle around enablement, around all of those is fascinating to me because in my career, I sort of sat in different seats looking at the same problem myself. What do you think that you've learned, or what's the takeaway from having sat in all of those seats throughout your time at Pramata?
I would say on the client end, it's just understanding business problems, like at
Okay.
depth, right?
Yes.
And understanding personas. How does the legal team view something? How does the sales team view something? Where's the synergy to make a solution that actually works? Because at the end of the day, if you look at CLM, it's not just for the legal team. It's an
Right.
wide tool, right? So you are not putting it
Yes.
there just to make people one team function, right? So
Right.
I think sort of understanding that the problem statement from different stakeholders and how do you kind of design something to enable that. The other
Yes.
piece I would also say is Pramod focused a lot on the repository and the contracts analytics side. So we got a little deeper on understanding how unstructured data can be converted to, really structured data from contracts and designing that so you can do a lot of reporting with all these business teams. So I think
Right.
that,
Those were early days to learn that, right? I mean,
yeah,
I talk to clients all the time these days about how the AI tools in the market allow for that, but I'm always educating to say they're not new. We're just using them in a more exposed way to the client, but we've been using them and building on them for many, many years.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's usually when people talk about CLM, they talk a lot about the ongoing and workflow and those aspects. This
Yeah.
end is something I think now legal teams are starting to realize the power of that data,
Yes, the
right?
data.
And then from there, when I moved to product, I think the biggest thing that I learned from a leadership standpoint first was you actually don't really have a lot of influence. I mean, in the sense, you're not someone who can tell people what to do. You kind of have to help them get on the journey on how to enable them, which is a
Yeah.
little bit from the solutioning end. But the
Yeah.
other side is you see a lot of use cases across the board, and how do you find the right patterns to solve, what do you want to design for? So it's not
Yeah.
like you can take, when you're dealing with one client, you may solution it, you may figure out something and you would move ahead. But when you're actually building product, a lot of it is thinking about the patterns across the board and
Yes.
what impact that can have, not just for one client, but for multiple clients. And at the end of the day, I think I learned a lot about usability and how to make it adoptable for people, because you need to keep users very, and I think this goes even to any implementation you do in CLM. The big lesson is how do you think about adoption by design right from the beginning? And
Yes.
product teams teach you that a lot, because they're like, you can't just throw over features over the wall. You need to like
Right.
figure out how you're going to take the user along with you. So I spend a lot
Agree.
of time sitting down with lawyers and just watching them do their work and then going, okay, this is the step by step process that they're doing. How do I now optimize for it? How do we build things that will support that aspect? Not to say that we didn't do it during the implementations, but that's a different angle. But
Totally different
here,
angle. Totally different angle. Because I think when you're working on product, it's something similar I found when I was in customer success supporting CLM is that you can take many requests about, enhancements and things that customers want to see in the product, and they're wonderful and they're valid and they would be fantastic. And you learn about ways to feed into the product and make it better. But it's important to note for customers and clients to understand they're implementing that you are a subset of a very large customer base, and the product team has to funnel all of the requests they may have for greatness. Many of them are very valid and wonderful things to request to be changed in the product or updated or added to, but there's a process that happens on the product side to make sure those changes are patterns you're seeing across your customer base, right? And then to figure out technically how to do that and when to roll it out. It's a larger component that I think many clients understand, unless and until they get into the implementation stage where they're looking at enhancements and ways that they want to change or add to the product. So I think that's a great perspective and angle to think about is the voice of the customer is very important, but it has to be synthesized and it has to meet the needs of the greater customer base for the clients to implement. So anyway, I love that thought. We don't talk about it enough.
yeah.
So I'm wondering sort of coming full circle, if you will, into what you're doing now. I feel like everything you talked about are stepping stones into the journey of innovation at large. So tell us a little bit about how you transitioned into the space that you're in now.
Yeah, so I took a break after, 14, 15 years of working with Pramata. And then I said, okay, I think I need to think about what I want to do next. And I took like this 7th-month break just to think through and just sort of unlearn and relax and all of those aspects. And then, but over the years, I networked a lot with people in the space. And one of them led me to the current team that I work with. They introduced me to the team. So the parent company I work for, it's called Vahura, which is actually India's best search and executive recruitment firm in the country for the last 15 years. And, they kind of do it in all streams, hiring lawyers, board advisory, all these aspects end to end. They started a sister concern about 4-5 years back called COUNSELECT. And that's where they started out on the secondment side, which is bringing in lawyers in that space. But what they realized is as they were, because it's a secondment model in recruitment, you don't get to see the ring side. But with secondment, it's your secondees who are in the companies, right? And you're getting a lot of context ring side from them on what is happening in the organization. So they started looking at, okay, hey, we're seeing problem statements come in terms of technology, in terms of process, from, clients beyond just the talent piece. They started thinking about that problem as well. And then when I met them, I had been thinking about this for a while. And
Just that,
yeah, exactly. I was just like, there's a common ambition that there's so much, honestly, there is appetite and attitude both for innovation, but there is a forum missing for legal teams, how to enable them on that front. And that's what we were discussing, because it wasn't that people were saying we don't want to do innovation. What we were realizing is that they just didn't know how,
Yes.
that was coming through a lot. And that's when I met them. We started brainstorming and around the second version of the organization to incorporate these areas and what we call innovation as a service. And that's how we started building, thinking about, okay, there are different areas. There's technology that you can think about in terms of how do you strategically have a roadmap on what areas you want to select technology and implement it. In some cases, it's not even ripping it out. It's multiplying the tech that you already have. Another area is contracts is a very vast space, right? It's not necessarily just about bringing in the tool, but even how do you build a center of excellence around all your contracting process across business stakeholders, right? Tools can enable you, but there's a lot more thought process to that. The other was also how do you look at matter management, vendor spend, all these areas, operating your legal teams as a business team. These were just themes that just kept emerging as they were talking to clients and as I was seeing in the industry peripherally beyond CLM. And we were like,
So
okay. Sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
there's definitely something here. So when you're thinking about those kind of buckets of transformation areas, I'm very interested in how you kind of break that down for a client of yours to get started, because as you know, they don't know how to get started or where to get started, and it probably feels overwhelming. So when we're talking about how to get started and just looking at the tech space innovation, and maybe that's not like ripping and replacing, as we all know, that's very expensive, but multiplying. So where do you kind of start that conversation?
So, in most situations, it's actually just trying to first understand their problem statements. It's not
Of
even
course, yeah.
going in and telling them what we offer. We can do
Hmm.
that, but it's oftentimes just when they hear things, they start thinking about, oh, we have a similar problem,
Hmm.
and then we just work backwards from saying, tell us more,
Right.
and kind of frame out what those areas. In some cases, it's very clear that they have existing technology, but it's just not to the extent that it's bringing in the best efficiency.
I find that often there are a lot of tools and they may not be used fully. They're using parts of them and they haven't expanded and they're not using full functionality. So I find that a lot. There needs to be some level of optimization, right? With the tools that they're
Yeah.
using. Yeah.
And the IT barrier to swap out a tool is so huge, right? Like
It is.
to go through that hoop again. I mean, I empathize a lot with legal teams because that's something that so we always say, okay, let's see if there is a way we can actually make this a multiplier game for you versus trying to rip out something. The other thing is also when we talk to them, sometimes they're very forward. GCs will always think about how do I prepare for the future, right? And in that case, it's a wide spectrum. They want you to analyze the whole legal team and the touch points and all of that and find out the problem areas that they need to improve on in comparison to where the industry is heading. So that's a very comprehensive then study and recommendations that come out through them. So it just depends on where they are in the spectrum of maturity. Sometimes
Right.
it's just about a tool. Sometimes it's rehauling the whole operating model. Sometimes it's looking at contracting. Sometimes it's just looking at some other area. First, we let them kind of uncover their problem statements and take it from there on what would be right, again, designing the right solutions, which
Yes.
includes, but always with a tech first approach along with innovation, right? Because you can't, so putting people on the problem alone won't solve it. So
Correct.
just that's the one thing that we bring in when we speak to them as well. One other trend that we've seen also is that there's a lot of now legal capability centers that people want to open up, especially in India, like bringing in more and more work, because what used to be considered as low complexity, high volume work now has changed to really strategic work, but tapping into the talent. But how do you
Yes.
build a capability center? So we kind of help them then build, operate it for a while, and kind of transfer it back to them, sort of a model as well.
Does
Start
that
keep
feed into
unlock.
the center of excellence piece of it? I'm so curious about how you look at the framework around contracting centers of excellence, because it always feels like such a massive endeavor to set up a contracting center of excellence. So how do you introduce that concept? What are the sort of baby steps, or how do you frame that when you're working with a client around setting up a center of excellence?
You said it, it's baby steps. You begin with the simplest area, like move over your NDAs
Hmm.
process, move over maybe your procurement contracts, something like that. So you start then figuring out what tools, what kind of talent do you need to drive that you can bring over, what process can you set up, run that, and then start expanding into the other value areas that you can bring in. So usually you start with something as simple as NDAs, to be honest with you, to
Yeah.
set and prototype that. And then once they start seeing the value of how that's running, we have been then able to expand into other contracting areas, go into deeper areas. Sometimes it's data privacy, sometimes it's something else. So once you've crossed the first barrier, I think success begets success, right?
Okay.
Once
Agree.
you,
Agree.
yeah, once you cross the first barrier, and you need to do it slow to kind of, in a way, guinea pig a certain area that they considered valuable, but a little less risky to start off with.
Yeah, NDAs are always my favorite because they're high volume, low risk, and it's a great place to automate, and it's a great place to include a center of excellence. And so for those folks that aren't familiar with what a center of excellence is for contracting, could you break it down for us a little bit? What are the typical functions, or what is the work?
Yeah, usually. So when we look at it, it's pretty much figuring out starting from end to end. How do you look at it? Like, how do you have standardized templates? How do you have playbooks in place? That's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. And then there is also the technology that will help you, either like a front desk, or maybe you already have a CLM tool that you can bring into the mix where the NDA process can kick off. How do you work with business stakeholders as well to kind of build the touch points? If we're talking, I'm just taking the NDA example here,
Sure.
on who's requesting for it, what's the SLA around that, just kind of building that whole stack, right from where the contract originates to, sort of managing that and the stakeholders in between, right? So that's the thought process. It plays a big role, but a lot of it is how do you think about process and the kind of talent also you need that would be today solving for this, but over a period of time is also unlocking more and more value areas that they can work on.
And it's so curious to me because I feel like the work is similar to getting ready for a CLM
Yeah.
implementation itself, right? You have to do that groundwork of, if you have playbooks, understanding your templates and sort of getting your house in order. And I don't think enough clients start there. They kind of jump in thinking that that's all going to get sorted out in the implementation, and it can, but it does impact timelines and, of course, cost of the project when you have folks helping you stand all of those things up. So the more that you can gather templates, playbooks, process, understanding all of those things when you come to any vendor looking for help in the contracting world, that's you have such a leg up on helping us help you, if you will, right? We can
Yeah.
gather that data because we need it to make informed decisions and help you with your contracting processes. What kind of size organization, or what is the volume that you typically see around centers of excellence for contracting? Is there a marker that you look for? Like, at this point, you're ready for this kind of help, or does it vary?
It varies actually. Usually, when something like that happens, it's often that they're already thinking about setting something up like that, and then
Yeah.
it's like, how do we start this process, right? Like that's the thinking. I don't think volume is necessarily the only reason. Used to be back in the day, but
Mhm.
now I think more and more organizations are thinking, how do I think one vector we've seen when we talk to general counsels and in-house teams is there's a lot of pressure on budget, right?
Yes.
And the board and exec management is actually cracking down on how efficient and how cost efficient are you. So that also leads then to the center of excellences to actually enable that, right? Because the cost arbitrage matters pretty much there as well. So then it's not a volume game; it's also kind of seeing how can you look at the cost part that comes in from a budget standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I talk to clients a lot that are looking to do more with less money these days, right? There's budget cuts, staffing cuts. They're not looking to hire. We're looking at budget cycles now, and there's less money in the
Yeah.
pot to do things with. And so when you're looking at how important contracting is, this is such a valuable way to, to answer those budget questions, but still get stellar work and work product. So I love centers of excellence, and of course, I love tech and tools to help for contracting. What are some other ways that you're seeing, or what other conversations are you having around innovation for legal teams besides centers of excellence, and obviously looking at sort of tech stacks and how to optimize those tools? I think we mentioned another bucket. So what were the other areas that you're seeing some innovation discussions out there?
I think one space that we see often is how litigation management tools are. That's one thing where people are like, we need better tools to kind of the case management and the whole thing, because that's one thing we've seen at least 3 out of 5 GCs come back saying, what's the tech stack that's out there that can help us manage that better? I think there's more awareness now also on the spend management with outside counsel. There's so many questions being asked
Yes.
about that, because that's one of, I think in most in-house teams, that's one of the areas where they're spending a lot of the budget on as well, right? So then the
Right.
question comes in saying, how are you optimizing for that, and how are you looking at those areas? So then we have questions to think about. How are you selecting your outside counsel? How are you looking at the way those contracts are with them in terms of structuring? Like a law firm could have like 10 people on a call. Are you going to pay for all 10 people? Like the way you're thinking about the whole thing, right? Like, so there's areas that they're seeing from tooling. There's areas from changing the way you're running a certain function. The other thing I would also say is there's a huge shift in also running innovation or culture mindset shift workshops with teams. That's
Oh, I
one
love
thing that,
that. Tell me
yeah,
more about that.
yeah. So because innovation isn't something you can, it's change, honestly. The other word for innovation is change, right?
And
Whatever it
that's a
may be.
big, broad topic, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's if you want to move your legal team to be doing a lot more, I think one is to kind of help them understand what that lot more can be and how do you do that. And you can't just
Yes.
have that conversation in like one call on Zoom or something like that, right? You need to like work with them through the day to kind of unlock those areas, contextualize pain points through them, then say, okay, this is how you can think about solving it. How do you like change the way even goals or OKRs are done for legal teams to think about, room to change their roles in this context also, to create
Yes.
incentives for it. So I think
Yes.
there's a lot of courses and management programs that kind of help with leadership in those areas. I think legal teams are also looking for help in, driving innovation and helping them get up to speed on these things. We do sometimes design thinking or all those aspects that you can help them think about, because these are now peripheral skills that lawyers are expected to pick up as well,
Right.
along with project management and those areas, right? So
Right.
it's
And
again,
running a budget and a business and all the
yes,
things.
yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not even about going in and bringing in a tool or a process. It's just like helping them change mindsets around it, getting away from the day to day and just doing a workshop and thinking through problem statements free of the other this thing. And how do you think about innovation? What does I think has the discourse around AI has brought a lot of questions for people. They're interested in
Yes.
how do you prototype for it? How should I think about AI? All these aspects, right? So I think that's also unlocked opportunity for people to run these workshops as well.
I love the workshop idea because you get, again, so much understanding when you can ask questions. And I think your perspective is unique. I have a similar one in that I worked in the industry for a long time before I implemented the tool, before I advised on in transformation. And so you see a lot, right? You see a lot of use cases, you see a lot of successful projects and projects that are not successful. And you take all of those learnings and you can apply those when you're hearing them sort of talk about the things that they're trying to tackle. So I think it gives a unique perspective to have that legal lens, but also have the tech training, right? So I love that about your background. Um, one thing I wanted to ask you is something that I've seen is a change in how legal teams are run and staffed. It used to be that, like, back when I worked in the legal industry, it was a GC that was in charge of all the things, and then there might be one or two attorneys that specialized, and then quite a few support staff that would deal with various matters, litigation, outside counsel. I'm just wondering, have you seen a change in how legal departments are run? Because my perception is they're run more leanly and more like a business. There is some generalist, some specialization. I'm just wondering sort of what you're seeing in your conversations around how legal departments are structured and how they're running these days.
I think the big shift is there's still some of the traditional element of having, the practice areas that people are in. And in-house contracting is still 60-70% of the work. So you do have that area. But what I'm seeing is the shift in roles like legal ops coming in.
Yes.
The multidisciplinary angle, I think, is something that legal teams are starting to explore now, knowing that they can't do everything.
Right.
And what I would say is lawyers are now expanding their skill set. One is to create roles that may go into legal ops and all that, but one there's a strategic expansion of the role of the in-house team itself. It's so becoming boundaryless, right? Because it's touching so many areas of the of the business.
Agreed.
Now, and Gartner calls this really in a good way, where they call it like the corporate sense maker, right?
Mm-hmm. I
So
love that.
so with that, then the focus areas are so much more than the traditional practice areas that we talked about with contracting or advisory, but it moves now to ESG, it moves now to, like data privacy, like all these different areas where the role just keeps expanding of these
Mm-hmm.
teams. As a result, what you're then seeing is an expansion of the skills and also their openness to bring on people with that kind of domain expertise who are not necessarily lawyers. So
Right.
I think, and the technology element is definitely there. They are leaner on the things that they can automate on those areas, but the roles are maybe changing is what i'm I'm seeing, and the expectations of business is a whole other take. Now they expect a more strategic seat from legal to advise on things, right? Like how can we do this?
Right.
And yeah, and I think legal's mindset is also shifting, where they're thinking how do they enable the business more and more, and how do they change, like become more extensions of their teams. Like one example I
Yes.
saw was with business, like when you talk about data privacy and things like that, in sales cycles now you have a privacy counsel
Yes.
sometimes. Roles, I think, is how legal teams are shifting. I think it's that lean for sure in places where they can bring in tech, but the skill set expansion and role expansions is what I'm seeing the difference in.
And how do you, when you speak to teams about this, how do they get enabled to be more business focused and more broad? Is that sitting down with your stakeholders and having an open door to understand their challenges? Is it courses? What are you seeing are successful ways that this new profession and this new expanded capability, how are they getting there?
I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing legal teams do now is actually understanding the business in depth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they're really, like if you're saying you're selling your products now with AI baked in, they're really trying to understand the offering in depth and what's the impact of that with clients so that we can structure better, right? And we can give real-time guidance. How are they inserting themselves in those conversations is one thing I'm seeing, because you can't be a strategic business partner if you don't understand business.
Of
So
course. Yes.
every GC that I speak to, we see the expectation that they're setting with their teams that you need to, collaborate a lot with the business end to understand their problem statements. I think speaking their dialect is what they're calling calling
Yes.
that. I would also say that when you um, the idea of how you're collaborating now is changing a lot. It's not like, there's a request coming to legal and then we'll figure it out. They're trying to be proactive. I think that
Mm-hmm.
shift also is happening in the way they are dealing with legal. I mean, dealing with business is one thing that I'm also seeing. In one panel, when I heard one of the GCs, she actually said, "We call ourselves change agents because we know as business shifts, we are the first people who needs to, be at the front line
Yes.
to think about what corporate policies need to change, all these aspects, and
Yeah.
drive that change." So they're now really bringing that impact forward, and yeah, they're to enable themselves business courses. All these things are coming in, but I think the first is with the intent to be a true business partner.
I think that's a change for sure because it used to be that legal were sort of the guardians and they were focused on the risk. And it's a shift to focus on the growth and how to enable that safely and considerately. So I definitely think it's a change. And I don't know how close you stay to legal education and frameworks for new lawyers, but I have conversations with friends of mine that are in that space, and the education that attorneys are now receiving is layered with how to be a good business partner and look at tech and technology. Are you seeing that as well, that they're getting a broader exposure to business?
I wouldn't say in India that's a lot yet from a legal education perspective. It's still early in the journey that I would say. I mean, there's of course newer law schools that are recognizing that and bringing those elements of learning about tech and those aspects. It's still slow though. A lot of the learning is still happening on the job.
I think
Like
so too. And I think there are pockets of programs that are introducing these concepts more as elective, not as part of core curriculum. but I see the shift slowly happening. I hope that it continues because it can only make our jobs easier.
Try to run, I think I recently, there's a Indian legal tech network in India, and they did a innovation sprint in a law school. So there are organizations that are also trying to, drive those aspects, but still most of it is on the job that you're learning. But I would say one thing, the difference is also the new generation is already tech native in their world, right? Like
Yes, that's
they
true.
they are born in technology basically. So I
Yeah.
think for them, they expect it when they move around organizations to see whether things can be done with technology. There's that pressure coming in, even if the law schools haven't evolved. That I've seen as well. When I talk to the younger lawyers, they're like, but we could do a lot of these things with tools, and we want to push for that from that angle, because they
Yeah,
live their world in a tech native world, right? So I think that,
that is true.
yeah, so it's a different angle of a pressure sort of coming in, I think, for the in-house teams to also match where talent is going today.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I remember in my early days, and I don't know if yours was education was like this, but I did sit in the law library and read actual case law.
Yeah.
And it's a total different shift for today's people that are being educated because it is mostly technology that they're using, as you said. Of course, that shift should organically happen, which is exciting, right? I think we've covered a lot of ground here, all really great insights that you have in your role. What do you think if we were to summarize how you would approach innovation within your legal department, can we summarize sort of where the top maybe 3 to 5 areas to focus are for our listeners? If we can kind of synthesize our conversation down, what would you say they were?
See, I think the first is kind of understanding what your service portfolio itself is to the business, right? So if you can
Yes.
understand what is business as usual and what are areas that, are emerging to be more proactive, right? Then the business as usual is a space where you can then decide, I can optimize certain things there faster, right? Like, so I
Mhm.
think to take that step back and think about, what's my service portfolio like? That's where I would always recommend starting from, and then to sort of systematically understand how you look at it. The talent is the second angle. How are you structured? And also, are you too talent dependent? Just calling that out, because that's one thing where corporate memory becomes really, really critical. And I've
Yes.
seen that as a huge problem in most legal teams. The knowledge management and corporate memory sadly doesn't exist in a lot of places. Or if it does,
Yes.
it's very scattered. And uh, that the point which you talked about readiness, a lot of those problems come because you just don't have any corporate memory anywhere, or knowledge
Right.
management anywhere. So we always recommend, are you putting in systems to look at knowledge management? And so you're less dependent on people, and even if people move around different lateral functions, they know where the starting and end points are, right? So that I think, but and the third vector is technology. You're not escaping it now.
No.
That's the what I say is, with AI, everybody is very saturated with seeing a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. But what it has done now is proven the point that legal teams cannot afford to be tech agnostic at all.
Great.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
think that if you start from looking at your service portfolio, and also then looking at, how you're creating knowledge management and like a systems driven approach, and then seeing your tech stack and how the talent is sort of, overlaid in that context, I think that's where the modern legal department is moving essentially.
Nishai, I love that. That was such a great summary. And I think the modern legal department is where we're all headed. And the tools, the technology, the process, the knowledge management, the talent, they're all considerations. They're super important. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I love this conversation. I could talk to you for 4 more hours, so I'll have to have you back for another episode. Vaishali, thank you so much for everything you shared today. I know we covered the spectrum of innovation topics and sort of things that the modern legal department can think about. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. And I'll have your contact information below so folks can reach out to you. Thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you, Cami. It was wonderful to be on, and I love talking to you as well.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll have to have you back for another episode. More to talk about in the ways the modern legal department is facing those innovation challenges. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Cami.